Have you ever taken your child to a place overflowing with light, only to realize that light was never meant for them? I have. My name is Jamal Thompson, a Black CEO, and I lived that moment. My daughter Layla was only 12, carrying her love for ballet in her eyes like it was a sacred secret. I held her hand as we stepped into that prestigious ballet school, each tap of our shoes on the polished marble floor echoing in the cold, distant air. An air that had already decided we didn't belong. I heard the whispers. Saw the half-smiles. One parent let their gaze slide down to Layla's worn-out ballet shoes and said, almost casually, "This school isn't for everyone." It stung. Of course it did. But in Layla's eyes, I saw a flame they couldn't put out. They thought they had silenced her with their laughter. What they didn't know was that their laughter was the drum roll. Because when Layla stepped out for her solo, what they were waiting for wasn't the dance, it was the fall. But that moment flipped the entire room on its head. Silence fell. Not the silence of contempt. The silence of surrender. And in that silence, years of prejudice cracked wide open, exposed for everyone to see. If you've ever watched your child get mocked simply for being different, if you believe silence itself can be turned into a weapon, then this story is for you. Before we begin, hit like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because every click shines a light on the story society tries to keep in the dark. Now, let's go back to that first moment. The door to the ballet school swings open. Layla squeezes my hand. The snickers ripple through the room. And from that very doorway, a chapter no one expected is about to begin. I held Layla's hand tight as we stepped into the gleaming ballet hall. The sound of shoes clicking on the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat, a cold kind of music that didn't welcome strangers. Layla looked up, her wide eyes glowing like tiny lanterns, reflecting the glittering crystal chandeliers above. She smiled softly, an innocent, unshaken smile. I looked at her and thought, those eyes had never known how cruel a room could be, how laughter could cut deeper than words. The air was cold. Not the kind of cold from air conditioning, the kind that came from glances, quick and measuring, as if weighing our worth before we even crossed the room. We walked in. But the room didn't open up. It stood still, like a silent gatekeeper, forcing us to feel like intruders. Layla didn't notice. She kept looking at the paintings along the hallway, portraits of dancers frozen in perfect poses. But I saw it clearly. Those weren't just paintings. They were warnings, the standards this place worshipped, sharp-edged, brittle, waiting to cut. We hadn't taken 10 steps before a woman approached. Her dress had no wrinkles. Her face was full of them, the kind pride leaves behind. She stopped in front of Layla, her gaze sweeping over the worn pink ballet shoes on my daughter's feet. I felt the chill spread from her eyes, as if my child wasn't a little girl, but a mistake scuffing the polished floor. "This school isn't for everyone," she said. Her voice was low, but it stayed in the air like a stain. Layla blinked, not fully understanding. She only squeezed my hand tighter. I nodded at her, then led her forward. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence is sharper than words. It works like a mirror, showing the ugliness of others without you having to say a thing. But silence doesn't mean I didn't hear. As we walked away, a whisper floated from behind us. "That girl, she won't last one class." A chuckle followed. Soft, harmless on the surface. But it cut like a blade under the ribs. They thought it was a prediction. To me, it sounded like a declaration of war. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see the face behind the words. People think darkness hides cruelty. It doesn't. It just makes cruelty echo louder. And after years of sitting in boardrooms filled with polite poison, I'd learned this much. The ones who laugh behind your back are often the first to bow when the truth finally walks in. Layla, though, she was different. Her head stayed high, her eyes still wandering with curiosity. I realized children's hearts had a strange resilience against contempt. But I also knew, one day she'd understand every giggle, every glance from tonight. And when that day came, I prayed this memory wouldn't make her shrink. I prayed it would become the fire that made her rise. We walked toward the main practice hall. The door was half open. Piano music drifted out, smooth, distant, like a conversation we hadn't been invited to join. I placed my hand on the doorknob. Layla looked up at me, her eyes shining, waiting. I smiled, though the echo of their whispers still lingered inside me. "Let's go, Layla," I said softly. Sometimes the doors that don't want us are the ones we leave our mark on the deepest. I pushed the door open. Light spilled out, swallowing us whole. And in that moment, I knew the first battle had already begun, even if they thought we had only just arrived. The woman stood squarely in front of the studio door, as if she were the gatekeeper of an entire marble kingdom. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe, but it was enough to form an invisible barrier that made Layla and me stop short. Her eyes swept downward, pausing on my daughter's worn-out ballet shoes. A smile flickered across her lips, not a smile of welcome, but a blade-thin smile, cold and cutting. "This school isn't for everyone," she said softly, each word dropping heavy as stone. Layla didn't fully understand. She was still young enough to think such words were nothing but idle comments. But her small hand gripped mine tighter, trembling, as if to ask, "Daddy, why did she say that?" I pressed my lips together. Years spent in boardrooms where I'd been called too different to lead had taught me one thing. Sometimes the sharpest response is silence. I led Layla forward, letting my actions speak louder than any defense I could give. But make no mistake, Hazazats didn't mean agreement. No, my silence then was deliberate. I knew people like her wanted noise. They wanted you angry, loud, unruly, something they could point to and say, "See, always so emotional, always overreacting." I wasn't giving her that gift. I let her talk to herself, let her own words echo back, exposing their venom without my help. Layla looked up at me, eyes full of confusion. I bent down and whispered, "Come on, sweetheart." Some truths don't need to be shouted. She nodded, still unsure, but at least she learned one thing that day. Her father would not bow. We walked inside, and I could still hear the whispers behind us. Another voice, sharp as a needle. "Look at them. Probably think those ragged shoes can keep up with the piano." Laughter followed, high, brittle laughter that cracked like thin glass. I kept my pace steady. A thought crossed my mind, dry and bitter. They think they're the audience, but they don't realize they're the clowns in this circus. The wall at that door wasn't made of brick or stone. It was built from stairs, from whispers, from prejudices cemented through generations. And Layla and I, we were the ones being tested, to see if we could break through it. When my hand touched the studio door, I felt a weight behind it. Not real hands holding it closed, but the weight of every word we just heard. I took a deep breath and pushed. Light spilled out, pulling us into another world. The studio was wide and gleaming, mirrored walls reflecting rows of little girls. Blonde hair, white tutus, all adjusting their posture under the instructor's watchful eye. Perfect. Uniform. A single standard pressed into every frame. Layla's entrance was a dark ink blot on a pristine sheet of paper. Several heads turned immediately, eyes scanning, sizing up, as if calculating how long this difference would last, before it vanished. Layla swallowed hard. I squeezed her hand tighter. "Let them look," I whispered, "just for us. Every stair will be proof when we turn the tables." What they didn't know was this. Every wall they built had a crack. And sometimes all it takes to bring it down is a pair of small feet spinning hard enough to shake the ground beneath it. We walked in, leaving behind the smirks, the whispers, the knife-edged smiles. They thought they'd won a small battle. But I knew the real game was only beginning. The music from the studio floated out softly, as if trying to swallow every stray sound in the hallway. But behind me, a voice slipped through, quiet, neat, and merciless. She won't last a single day. I didn't have to turn around to know there was a smirk attached to it. It was the kind of voice that never speaks in the light, only survives in the shadows, where it thinks its contempt will stay safe from judgment. Layla didn't hear it. She was too busy staring at the mirrored walls reflecting the dancers at practice. But I heard it clearly. And inside me, the words carved deep like a thin blade. Because it wasn't just about my daughter. It was about me. About all of us. About a history stretched over centuries, stitched together by whispers just like that one. I paused for half a second. The thought came, should I turn around, say something, or let this silence hang like a blade above their own heads? I chose the second. Because I've learned something after all these years. Sometimes it's better to let people believe they've won a small victory, so that later, that victory becomes the very evidence of their own mediocrity. I kept walking. But in my mind, I marked that voice like a debt. I didn't know who said it. Didn't matter. Because by the end of the day, they would look at Layla differently. They would have no choice. And when that moment came, I wouldn't have to say a word. The truth would speak for me. A few giggles followed, soft but loud enough to peel the varnish off this prestigious place. I almost smiled. Funny, isn't it? People can spend tens of thousands of dollars on perfect shoes for their kids and still be bankrupt enough to invest only in mockery. Layla tugged on my hand. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide. "They're looking at me." I bent down, murmuring so only she could hear. "Let them look. The brighter you shine, the longer they'll have to stare." We stepped deeper into the studio. The floor-to-ceiling mirrors caught our reflection, just the two of us, in a forest of identical white tutus. Yes, Layla stood out. A single offbeat note in a rigid symphony. But sometimes, a single offbeat note is exactly where the real story begins. The whisper echoed in my mind like a hymn for the weak, the kind people repeat to reassure themselves. They thought Layla wouldn't last a day. But I knew the things that never last aren't the children who keep showing up. It's the rotten prejudices standing on legs too brittle to carry their own weight. I took a deep breath, letting the air heavy with perfume and children's sweat settle in my chest. I let the words sink like a stone to the bottom of a lake, still there, but the surface calm, ready to reflect something entirely different. Up ahead, Layla took her place in line. Her old shoes tapped lightly against the polished wood floor. She stood tall, looked into the mirror, and smiled, just a tiny, defiant smile. A smile no whisper could erase. I knew our story was only beginning. And I knew this much: the people laughing now wouldn't be laughing for long. Because silence never stays silent forever. One day it erupts. And when it does, it's never the child who has to explain themselves. It's the people who whispered. Layla began at the center of the line, where the mirrors reflected the whole class as one perfect frame. White tutus, shiny new shoes, neatly pinned hair. She stood there, small yet bright, trying to blend into the orchestra of synchronized movements. I watched her purse her lips, eyes locked on the teacher, copying every warm-up step. A little clumsy, but with a fire in her eyes that wouldn't let go. Then the instructor walked over. A tall woman with eyes like searchlights scanning every child. When she stopped in front of Layla, her brow twitched upward. Just for a second. But I knew that looked too well. It wasn't assessment. It was exclusion, dressed up in professional coldness. She paused, dragging the silence until it snapped taut. "Move to the back." Layla hesitated, confused, then obeyed, shuffling timidly toward the rear. I thought it would stop there. But the instructor wasn't done. "Actually," her tone dipped sharper, "you can stay off to the side altogether." The room went silent. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, quiet giggles rose from the front row. A few parents peered in from the hallway, nodding along as if they'd just witnessed a truth too obvious to deny. I gripped the edge of my chair until the wood bit into my palms. A memory flashed. 10-year-old Jamal told by the basketball coach, "Sit this one out, kid. The team will play smoother without you." I sat on that bench back then, watching my teammates run the court, each dribble landing like a hammer on my chest. And now, decades later, the same script was playing out. Only this time, it was my daughter being benched. Layla stood at the edge, fist clutching her tutu. I could see it, the sting behind her eyes, the silent question forming. Why am I the one who doesn't belong? I wanted to storm in to tell the whole room she had every right to stand there like any other child. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew what would follow. See, black parents always overreact. I wasn't going to give them that headline. Instead, I looked at Layla. She met my eyes. And something shifted. Instead of bowing her head, she lifted it. Her shoulders straightened. She might have been pushed to the edge of the room, but she stood like someone who refused to disappear. I smiled faintly. They thought power lived in deciding who got the center stage. But sometimes, real power belongs to the one at the edges, who refuses to shrink. The music started. The little girls raised their arms, spinning in unison. Layla followed from the margins, a beat behind, her movements rougher, less polished, but her eyes burned like twin spotlights. And right then I realized being pushed aside was never the ending. It was only the opening line. I leaned back, listening to the piano swell, wondering if they even understood what they were doing. Every time they pushed a child out, they weren't drawing a bigger circle. They were shrinking their own. The giggles came again. Soft at first. Then spreading like a stain. That sound, thin, sharp, needling, wasn't loud enough to fill the room, but it slithered into every corner. Not applause. Not music. Just cruelty disguised as comedy. Layla's cheeks flushed crimson. Her small shoulders trembled. Not from cold. From the sting of becoming entertainment. I wanted to stand. God, I wanted to. To tear through the laughter, point at them, and say, "Enough! You're laughing at a 12-year-old child." But I didn't. Because I knew what would follow. See, black parents, always too emotional. They'd twist my anger into their alibi. So I stayed seated. But my silence wasn't surrender. It was a weapon. The kind that lets mockery rot in its own echo until it stinks of its own emptiness. Layla turned, eyes glistening. "Daddy, what should I do?" I didn't answer right away. I just nodded. Small, steady, a promise without words. "I see you. You're not alone." The piano played on, indifferent to the cruelty spilling under its notes. A blonde girl in front spun wide on purpose, elbowing Layla, then laughed like it was all a mistake. More giggles joined in. The whole room became a cheap stage. But I stayed still. Because every laugh was building a case they didn't know they were writing. And Layla was the closing argument waiting to happen. Painfully, my daughter was learning what too many of us learned too early. Sometimes laughter isn't the sound of joy. It's the sugar coating on the knife. But she was also learning this. A knife cuts both ways. She straightened again. Kept moving. Kept dancing. I thought of my grandfather's voice. "Jamal, let them laugh. One day they'll choke on it." When the break came, the hallway filled with tap-tapping shoes and the powdery smell of chalk and sweat. Layla ran to me, curls flying, cheeks flushed. "Daddy," she said, breathless, eyes blazing. "I'm not staying on the sidelines." I knelt to her height, holding her small, trembling hands. Not trembling from fear. Trembling from fire too big for her chest to hold. "You don't need anyone's permission to stand there," I whispered. "When you dance, Layla, let them all watch." She nodded, fierce, stubborn, ready. That nod carried my whole childhood inside it. The childhood that learned to bow its head. The childhood she was about to set on fire. Parents whispered nearby, "Poor thing, but clearly she doesn't belong." Another added, "One look at those shoes, obvious, isn't it?" They spoke like merchants inspecting damaged goods, blind to the fact they were exposing their own poverty. Layla squeezed my hand. "Daddy," she said, I'll show them. I don't care what they think. I'm going to dance." I hugged her tight. "Let them think you'll fall," I murmured. "Then let the truth knock the air out of them." When the bell rang, the girls filed back in. Layla walked among them, small, defiant, flame flickering against the wind. They thought the wind would snuff it out. But I knew the wind was about to make it burn hotter. This wasn't just ballet anymore. This was the story that keeps writing itself in boardrooms, classrooms, dinner parties, anywhere they draw lines to keep us out. But tonight, Layla was about to cross the line. And when she did, the whole room would have to move with her. Class ended for a short break. The white tutus scattered like a flock of little birds leaving the nest, fluttering, chirping, alive with chatter. Layla stood a little apart, shoulders squared, catching her breath, sweat dotting her forehead. She kept her back straight, trying hard to look like she didn't notice the glances circling around her. Then one girl approached. Blonde hair, blue eyes, ballet slippers so new they still smelled like leather. She took Layla's hand, her voice dripping with honey. "You did really well, really." Layla smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a bit. I saw it, the way she exhaled, thinking she'd finally been accepted. But I knew better. That smile was too polished, too smooth. It wasn't kindness, it was a mask. And I was right. Just a few steps later, when Layla turned away, the blonde girl leaned toward her friends. The whisper slipped out, sharp and fast like a knife pulled from its sheath. And then the giggles came. Not loud, not roaring, but pointed, precise. They cut straight into Layla's back. I saw my daughter's shoulders stiffen. Her small hands went limp. She heard it. Layla turned, but the blonde girl was already smiling sweetly again, pretending nothing had happened. That smile, so perfectly fake, was proof enough. Cruelty doesn't always need fists. Sometimes it wears lip gloss and pearls. I took a slow breath. Anger surged inside me, but it was tangled with bitter irony. They teach ballet to express grace through the body, and these kids had mastered the art of performing cruelty with their smiles. Layla didn't cry. That's what cut me deepest and made me proudest. She bit her lip but lifted her chin higher. The light in her eyes didn't go out. It changed. From innocence to resolve. I looked at her, then at the cluster of giggling kids. And I realized this wasn't just children being mean. This was a miniature portrait of the world, where exclusion often wears perfume. A handshake, a compliment, a smile. And then the knife. But here's what they didn't expect. Sometimes those knives don't break people. They sharpen them. During the break, Layla walked toward me. Her face was calm, but her little fists clenched the hem of her tutu. I bent down, met her eyes, and said quietly, "You don't owe anyone your belief in fake smiles. Let the truth speak for you." She nodded, her eyes glistened. And I knew she understood. Just like I did. That laughter had marked itself as evidence. A blade waiting to swing back. I sat there thinking, how many times have black folks been handed fake compliments, polite smiles, only to be mocked the second they turned their backs? And how many times has that same betrayal forged a strength no one saw coming? Then it came. The sentence. The one they thought was quiet enough to vanish into the air. She'll never dance like we do. Clear, sharp, designed to land where it hurt. Layla froze for half a heartbeat. I braced myself for a bowed head, a tear, maybe even a silent plea in my direction. But no. She bit her lip and lifted her head higher. Eyes locked on the mirror. No tears. Not one. I sat there, my chest tight. As a father, I wanted to shield her, to smash every invisible dagger they threw. But beneath the ache, there was something else. A fierce, quiet pride. Because in that moment, my daughter did what so many grown men still can't. She turned hurt into posture. The room stayed noisy. Those kids thought they were just playing. But words leave bruises no one sees. And the parents in the hallway? They didn't intervene. Some even nodded along as if to say, "True enough, she doesn't belong." I almost laughed. They paid thousands for ballet lessons, for grace and elegance. And the main thing their kids were learning was how to weaponize words like cowards. Layla didn't back down. She stayed in position. Arms extended, a little tremor in her fingers, but steady. And in her eyes, a quiet flame flickered alive. I leaned back, letting the insults fall into the air between us. Because I knew, one day, Layla would turn every cut they made today into the fire that would burn down their certainty. I remembered all the times I'd heard it myself. "You'll never have a seat at this table. You'll never lead." At first, those words scarred me. But over time, they became fuel. I didn't just sit at the table. I bought the building. And now, here was Layla, standing where I once stood, proving history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it comes back with witnesses. Layla glanced at me. No words. But her eyes said it all. Daddy, I won't let them be right. And my eyes answered, you don't need tears to prove them wrong. I realized then, the blade they thought would kill something inside her, had only drawn blood from their own hands. The room still hummed with laughter, like they thought they'd scored some tiny victory. But I smiled to myself. A thin, sharp smile. Because laughter, when exposed, turns into testimony. It tells on itself. Always. The hallway stretched wide, polished floors reflecting designer shoes and diamond earrings. The air smelled of coffee and expensive perfume, the kind of mix that hangs like an invisible sign. This is our world, not yours. I sat on the bench, pretending to scroll my phone. But my ears were wide open. And then I heard it. Even if her dad's a CEO, ballet isn't for them. Laughter followed. Not loud, but metallic. Cold. I looked up. 3 parents huddled together, voices low, eyes darting toward me now and then like they were checking to see if the victim had heard the verdict. They thought whispers made them invisible. But people like me? We grew up hearing knives unsheathing in hushed voices. My ears were trained to catch every blade. I leaned back and smiled. Not a warm smile. A smile for the circus they didn't know they were starring in. They thought they were subtle. But every word had already betrayed them. The polish cracked. The bricks underneath showing. How pathetic. They talked about summer homes, about private coaches, about ski vacations. But the thing that united them most wasn't wealth. It was exclusion. The presence of one black child in a ballet class had become the threat that made them allies. A tight little circle. Drawn in pencil, erasing itself one line at a time. I stayed silent. Because if I spoke, they'd play dumb. Oh, we didn't mean you. You misunderstood. No? I wouldn't feed their theater. I'd let their own breath betray them. I remembered my first corporate boardroom, full of white men, the joke about the cafeteria being downstairs. I stayed quiet. And later that year, I signed the deal they begged for. Proof doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up with receipts. And today, history was about to rhyme. They thought ballet was their fortress. But if Layla got her solo, that stage would crumble. I put my phone down. Watched the sunlight slant through the windows. They thought whispers built power. But real power doesn't whisper. It stands. And waits. I smiled wider this time, letting them see it. One of the 3 parents looked away, uncomfortable. Because my smile was a mirror. And it showed them exactly who they were. I thought, how many whispers have floated down hallways like this? How many judgments thrown cheap and small, thinking they'd vanish into air? How many times have black kids been pushed out by verdicts spoken at a volume just low enough to escape accountability? And how many times have those whispers turned into sirens when the truth finally walked in? The lounge stretched out like the lobby of a luxury hotel. Warm golden light washed over leather armchairs, turning them into temporary thrones for parents who were certain they belonged here. On glass tables, cappuccinos steamed as if this were an art opening rather than a children's class. I sat alone in the corner. Chin in hand, I watched the chandelier scatter light. Each beam fell on a different face, faces taut with the certainty that their children were the rightful stars of this stage. Then the jabs began, steady, cold, falling like hail on a tin roof. I heard he's some kind of CEO. So what? Ballet isn't their world. Exactly. Having the money to get in the door doesn't mean you belong on the scène. The girl, she looks so out of the place. I stayed still, my expression unchanged. To outsiders, it might have looked like I didn't hear, but every word hit my ears, sharp as stones on glass. I simply chose not to bend down and throw the stones back. Part of me wanted to stand up, set the cup down, and say, "You've just proven this isn't art, it's a closed-door club." But I knew that would only gratify them. They'd laugh and say, "See, always overreacting." So I kept quiet. Not submission, strategy. I let them think they were winning while they were really unmasking themselves for everyone else in the room. A man in a pale suit glanced my way, then whispered to his wife, "See, like he isn't saying anything, knows his place." They chuckled, thin as a razor. I raised an eyebrow. How funny. They mistook silence for bowing. They didn't know my silence was a ledger, so one day, when the truth comes out, they'll have to repeat their own words, flushed with shame. I took a sip of water, not their cappuccino, but a bottle I'd grabbed on the way. Cool water slid down my throat, cleaner than any foamed milk artwork. Some things don't need latte art to prove their worth. Some people don't either. The piano from the studio drifted out, gentle, distant. It pulled me back to childhood, to the day I was cut from the basketball team for being not the right fit. I remember sitting alone, listening to sneakers thud while the coach whispered, "That kid's not going far." Today I was living it again, only this time, my daughter was in the storm's eye. I set the bottle down and breathed deep, letting the anger rolling in my chest settle. I told myself, "Jamal, you don't have to shout. Truth will shout for you. Your job is to sit here and wait." I looked around at faces chatting freely, believing their whispers had dissolved into the air. They didn't know I was etching every word into memory, marking each one as a debt to be collected. And I wondered, how many times have barbed remarks like these been spoken in elegant waiting rooms, assumed to vanish with the cappuccino steam? And how many times have those words become evidence, so that one day the mocked one stands and makes the entire room bow its head? Sitting there as the hailstorm of whispers fell, my mind slid into an old memory. What Layla faced in ballet was a mirror, reflecting my own childhood cracks that never fully healed. I saw myself at 10, on the neighborhood court. I loved that ball so much I'd shoot at dawn into a rusted rim. I believed hard work would earn me a starting spot. But when the roster was called, I was cut. Not for lack of skill or effort, just 3 tight words, not the type. I remember the bench under me, my worn shoes pressing the wood, eyes following teammates who weren't better, just closer to what the coach wanted. Taller, lighter, and most importantly, like the others. I bit my lip and refused to cry, knowing any tear would be labeled weakness. Years passed. I thought I'd left that behind. But watching Layla pushed to the edge of the studio, I knew the loop still spun. Different costume, same script. Yesterday it was basketball, today it's ballet. The message hasn't changed. We don't want you here. Across from me, a father sipped cappuccino, smiled at his wife, then glanced at me. I recognized that look, the same one from my old coach. The look of someone convinced they have the right to decide who gets the floor and who stays on the bench. I gave a small, bitter smile. The world changed. Tech boomed, skylines rose, yet prejudice stayed loyal, wearing the same old suit and repeating the same old lines. The memory hurt my chest, but it also sparked another thought. Maybe because I sat out back then, I understand the value of walking back in on my own feet. Maybe today Layla will learn that lesson, her way. I stared toward the studio door, where Layla stood at the end of the line. She kept going, matching the music despite the snickers. I saw myself in her and something more. Layla wasn't just reflecting my past, she was proof the loop can be broken. I remembered my first days as a CEO, fielding, "You sure? Can someone like you lead?" The same as "not the type," rephrased. I answered without speeches, by results. Contracts signed with my name on the line. Now Layla would get to write her own answer. I closed my eyes, took a long breath, let the shards of memory settle. I realized my anger wasn't only about today. It was about old wounds. But those scars had forged a patience that knows loops spin, until our hands are strong enough to snap them. I opened my eyes, lifted my chin, and fixed on the studio door. A quiet question rose. How many times have we been pushed out for being not the type? And how many times have we come back from the margins to redefine the type? The break bell rang, sharp, final, like a judge's gavel. The class filed back in, shoes tapping, white skirts swishing. A tidy tableau that felt fake. I stayed in the lounge, eyes on the door slowly closing, a witness forced to watch from a distance. The teacher stepped out, papers rustling in her hand. She stood center room, eyes sweeping faces, voice level with that familiar lofty tilt. At the end of today's class, we'll have solo assessments. Each of you will have a chance to perform. Buzz rippled instantly. Girls giggled. Parents straightened up, eyes lit with promised pride. I knew what they pictured, their daughters spinning under the lights, proof their money had purchased excellence. Then the teacher paused. Her voice dropped, cooler, sharper. But, Layla, you don't need to participate. One sentence and the air shifted. Through the doorway, I saw my daughter freeze. Small shoulders locked. The room perked up like it had heard a natural law confirmed. Nods. Whispers. Well, of course, she's different. No one looked surprised. They absorbed it as if it were gravity. Water flows downhill. Girls like Layla stand outside. I didn't move, but a storm rose in me, quiet, heavy, gathering like thunderheads before the break. I watched Layla swallow and clutch the hem of her skirt. No tears, but the hurt was written clear. A parent near me murmured, "Syrup sweet. Probably for the best. If she performed, she'd throw off the formation." Another snickered behind a hand like they'd heard a clever joke. I tilted my head and smiled. Funny, they thought they were discussing art. It sounded more like a flea market selling prejudice. I thought of Layla. She'd been pushed to the back row, turned into a punchline, handed fake smiles and whispered blades. Now they were cutting her out of the solo, the one chance to speak with her body. They thought they'd won. But often being cut is the fuse that flips the entire board. I sat still and let the storm build. No need to shout now. What they decided would become a trap of their own making. When a room worships safe uniformity, it never expects the kid they pushed out to become the center. I inhaled, eased my grip on the chair, eyes never leaving Layla. She stayed there, unmoving, but in her bright eyes I saw a silent flame. They thought they snuffed a candle. They'd just lit a torch. And I wondered, how many obvious decisions have pushed Black people out? How many times were we denied a turn only for that denial to expose the smallness of those in charge? How many shows without us became the emptiest stages of all? When it was time for solos, the room suddenly went quiet. The teacher stood in the center, face stern, eyes scanning each student as if assessing them. She waited for a hand to go up. None did. The girls in white skirts, usually chattery and bright, lowered their heads, glanced at one another, pressed their lips tight, fussed with their laces. The piano kept playing, stranded in the air like a soloist abandoned on stage. A strange silence spread, not the silence of focus, but the silence of fear. The whole class dodged the teacher's gaze. No one dared step forward. I watched and couldn't help a quiet laugh inside. Ironic. Children raised with every advantage, and when it's time to show something, they shrink this small. This elegant room has everything except the simplest thing: courage. It felt like an arena missing its fighters. The bout had been announced, the audience seated, and still no one wanted to walk into the light. I tilted my head and watched the teacher. Annoyance flashed across her face. She hadn't expected that when she offered a fair chance to everyone, no one would take it. Maybe they were afraid to be wrong, afraid to lose face, afraid the spotlight would expose that they weren't as good as their laughter had bragged. I took a small sip of water and let the quiet stretch. I knew a trap was being set, not by me, but by the cowardice now on open display. A few parents in the hallway started whispering, "Why won't anyone try?" Another replied, "Pressure, probably, who wants to be a joke in front of the class." The words landed, by accident, right on the nerve. Because while they feared becoming a joke, my daughter had been labeled the joke from the moment she walked in. That's the difference. The other kids feared becoming Layla. Layla had been branded from the start. I looked at my daughter. She stood still, eyes on the teacher. No hesitation, only waiting. In that posture, I read one thing: she wasn't going to miss a chance, even if the chance came wrapped in a smirk. The teacher cleared her throat and swept the room again. Still silence. Still no hands. The awkwardness was obvious. She clenched her stack of papers, released it as if weighing something. And I knew the trap was about to snap shut. With the whole class backing away, every eye would be forced to the one child still standing tall. And that child, ironically, was the very one they'd crossed off the list. I drew a breath, set my bottle down. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with certainty. This was the moment the people who thought they were in control would paint themselves into a corner. A bitter thought flickered. Was this art or a social game? When the worthy flinch, and the wrong type is the one ready to step up. The room went still, like a curtain waiting to rise. I looked at Layla and knew the audience was not ready, but they were about to see something they wouldn't forget. And I wondered, how many times do silences like this appear in life? How often does the crowd's retreat open a path for the one they tried to exclude? How many empty stages have become launch pads for a reversal? The silence stretched to the point of discomfort, and the teacher had to find an exit. She turned, eyes landing on Layla, and a half smile appeared. Not encouragement, a smile from someone who just thought up a cruel little joke. Why don't you try? Show the class the difference. The room broke into laughter. Not giggles now, but sharp bursts like strings of firecrackers. A few girls covered their mouths, but the gleam in their eyes gave them away. Even some parents in the hall smiled, nodding, as if they'd been handed bonus entertainment. I sat still, but one question circled in my head. Do they truly believe this is art? Or is it a mock trial where my child is turned into the defendant so the room can enjoy a pre-written verdict? Layla stood there, eyes wide. She knew that tone wasn't an invitation. It was a trap, a shove toward the cliff's edge, hoping the little black girl would tumble in front of everyone. My chest tightened, but when Layla looked over at me, I saw more than fear in her eyes. Beneath it was a familiar spark, the one I'd seen when she kept practicing turns through her 10th fall without quitting. A parent near me whispered, "Well, at least we'll get a little drama." The person beside them snorted, "Yeah, let's see how different looks when it's offbeat." I raised an eyebrow and smiled. Hilarious. They pay for ballet lessons, but the only lesson truly landing is how to clap for cheap comedy. Layla inhaled. I saw her hand tremble, but she didn't step back. She looked to me for a cue. I gave a slow nod. Not permission, a message. If you step out there, step like someone rewriting the rules. The laughter hadn't fully died. Someone even whistled. The teacher folded her arms, waiting, certain of the outcome. A stumble, a few tears, and a room freshly reassured it was right, God. But cruelty is a double-edged blade. Push someone to the edge, and you might hand them the only chance they need to prove what no one expected. Layla walked to the center floor. Every eye locked on her. The laughter faded into a tense hush. The predators quiet, waiting for a prey to trip. I sat up straight, unblinking. A quiet question rose. How many times are we turned into punchlines for being different? And how often do we pivot and turn the whole room into unwilling witnesses? The room held its breath. I knew the next moment would test more than Layla. It would test this entire room. Layla looked at me. Her eyes were wide, clear as a lake before the wind. In them I saw everything. A child's tremor, standing before a room waiting for her to fall. And a small, stubborn flame ready to flare to prove them wrong. I said nothing, I just nodded. That tiny nod sent a tremor through her. To me, it wasn't mere encouragement, it was a push into the current after she'd stood too long on the bank, unsure whether to leap, and in that instant, I let go. Layla drew a long breath. Her little chest rose, collecting air for the first step. The laughter still lingered. The parents' whispers still pricked the air, but over all of it, Layla heard one thing, her father's nod. In silence, I thought, the arrow they loosed wasn't aimed at Layla. It was aimed at the faces doing the laughing. The irony is they strung the bow for me themselves, with every slight since the start. The teacher stood with arms crossed, that half smile still fixed. She clearly believed she'd engineered a diversion, but looking at Layla, I knew the diversion was about to become the performance no one expected. Layla stepped to dead center. Her worn shoes gave a soft tap, 2 first notes of a score. No applause, no encouragement. The air congealed, like a hearing where the accused must prove she deserves to exist. I leaned back, heart thudding. A dry, sardonic thought surfaced. They've paid thousands for lessons, hired private coaches, and now they stand aside waiting for a black child in scuffed shoes to show the courage they won't. Layla set her hands on her hips, closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them. And the eyes that looked out weren't afraid anymore. They belonged to someone stepping into a fight. In that instant, she didn't need another word from me. The nod had become a command. I remembered what my grandfather used to say. Sometimes one nod from someone who believes in you can drown out 1,000 jeers. Today, I finally understood its weight. The room was silent, every gaze on Layla. I knew that once she moved, the silence wouldn't belong to contempt anymore. It would belong to recognition. I glanced around and caught a few parents shifting. Uneasy, perhaps realizing their little joke had turned into a risky bet. I smiled. They thought they'd put Layla on the board as a pawn. They forgot pawns can start fires and set up checkmate. Layla lifted her chin, ready. The room seemed to stop breathing, and I wondered, how many times do we need only a single nod to turn fear into backbone? How many times has a tiny signal flipped the whole game? The music swelled, each piano key hitting the wood floor like the first drops of rain. Layla drew a breath, shoulders set, one small foot lifted, and wobbled. The room lit up as if someone struck a match. Snickers popped from the rows, quickly rising into a chorus. A girl hissed loud enough for the whole line to hear. "Told you!" The laughter braided together, like they'd all been waiting for this second to certify their prejudice as truth. I didn't move, but I didn't take my eyes off Layla. She turned again, her foot skidded, her arms lost the count. The laughter swelled, bolder now, surer. A few parents in the hall tilted their heads and smiled, as if enjoying the climax of a cheap comedy. In that instant, I saw the glee on their faces, the kind that blooms only when people believe they're watching a failure preordained. They thought the show was over in a handful of beats. I slowly crossed my legs, hand on the armrest. A faint smile touched my mouth, not for Layla, but for a crowd so eager to be easy marks. Funny, thousands spent on art, yet the only art they truly savor is someone else's stumble. Layla paused. She bit her lip, eyes on the floor. The laughter kept tugging her downward, then, in a brief hush between piano phrases, Layla lifted her head. Her eyes found mine, the same eyes I'd nodded to a moment before. And I knew that wobble wasn't an ending, it was an opening. She turned again, still a tremor there, but this time her foot landed firmer. I saw the change, small but certain, while the crowd didn't. They were still laughing, convinced the joke was ongoing. They didn't know they were watching the prelude to a different song. I tilted my head and said nothing aloud. Keep laughing. Your delight will be the bleachers for a reversal you won't be able to swallow. A girl elbowed her friend, pointed at Layla, then cackled. In Layla's eyes, a new light flickered. Not the hurt of a child, but the look of someone who's just found a reason to turn a fall into a counterstrike. The music kept flowing, steady, indifferent to the laughter. Layla began to match it more closely, slowly, deliberately. I sat upright, heart quickening. A few more counts I knew, and the room would find it had no laughter left. And I wondered, how many times do they gather to relish our fall, certain they're witnessing the failure they ordered, only to watch that very moment open the door to something undeniable? The piano kept its current, and a beat after the stumble, Layla turned, not to escape, but to step into a different dance. Her body unlocked, her arms lifted, sure, supple, as if the air itself was carrying her. Those small feet spun, no longer shaky, but grounded, measured. It happened so fast the laughter didn't have time to stop, it simply got swallowed. The air shifted. A breath ago, faces were lit with glee, expecting a crash. Now eyes widened. The cheap thrill dissolved into a quiet confusion. I watched Layla, a bright surge rising in me. She wasn't just dancing, she was rewriting the story, one movement, one turn, one lifted arm at a time. A girl who'd been howling a moment earlier now stared, mouth still open, sound gone. Even the parents in the corridor leaned hard into the glass, eyes glued to the floor. I smiled. Ironic, they thought they were watching a joke. Instead, they'd scored front row seats to a performance no one invited them to, and everyone had to witness. Layla kept turning. Each circle erased another whisper from earlier. Every step was a strike through the sentence this room had pronounced on her. With each phrase, her eyes shone brighter, as if to say, "This is the difference you're going to memorize." The teacher, the one with that half smile, wasn't folding her arms anymore. She leaned in, narrowing her eyes, unsure of what she was seeing. That was the look of someone who thought she directed the play and now had to watch the script rewrite itself. Layla reached, folded, and sprang up with crisp lift. In that beat, the room had no laughter left. Only breath, ragged from people who'd been certain they knew the ending. My chest went light. Not because they were quiet, but because Layla had found a way to turn weight into wings. She didn't need me to speak. Her body spoke. A nearby parent muttered, "God, this kid." His voice faltered, certainty leaking out of it, as if language had betrayed his first take. I looked away, swallowing a wry smile. "Yeah, keep muttering. In a moment you'll be hunting new words, the ones you hate to say most, the words that admit you were wrong." Layla spun once more, curls flying, cheeks flushed. As the piano line stretched, I knew this was only the opening. And I wondered, how many times do we start with a wobble, and a beat later turn it into a pivot that flips the room? How often does laughter that aims to drown us end up drumming the intro to our win? The piano faded, trailing off like smoke. Layla finished her final turn and stopped dead center. Small feet planted, arms open, chin high, eyes straight into the mirror. A packed room suddenly felt vast. No laughter, no whispers. Silence flooded in, so dense you could slice it. Not contempt anymore. Something else, recognition they didn't want to voice. I looked around. The once chattery girls stood still, eyes wide, lips parted. Even the parents who'd nodded when she was pushed aside now craned toward the glass, eyes fixed on the figure in the middle. A crowd that had waited for a fall now had to witness a stance. I leaned back and let a small smile come. The irony was clean. They shoved her to the margins to protect their precious uniformity. From that very edge, Layla walked into the center, and no one dared move to take it back. The teacher, the one who'd framed her invitation with a smirk, clutched her papers tight. No applause, no praise, but her brow gave her away. That's the face of someone trying to hide a truth she doesn't want to accept. The biggest lesson of the afternoon didn't come from her, but from the child she'd excluded. Layla kept still, didn't bow. That's what made me proudest. She didn't rush to trade the moment for approval. She let the silence stretch as if daring the room. Which of you is brave enough to break this acknowledgement first? No one moved, no one laughed. And in that quiet, I heard another sound, the sound of truth, louder than any score. A parent near me cleared his throat, then swallowed it back. A child half lifted a hand as if to fake a clap, then froze under the eyes around her. The room was stuck in silence like actors who'd forgotten their lines, left to stare at one another. I sat back, took a slow sip of water, and savored it. This is life's strange justice. The ones who laughed loudest find their mouths sealed by awe. And Layla, my daughter, did it without a single word. Layla lowered her arms but kept her spine tall. I saw her mouth tip up, not a triumph grin, but the smile of someone who knows her worth, even if the room can't say it out loud yet. In my chest, a question rang through every corner of the quiet. How many times have Black people been forced into silence? And how many times has that very silence become the weapon that makes the whole room listen? The silence held for a few more seconds, and in that pocket of quiet, I saw something rare, a shift. The same faces that had snickered, that had nodded along to Layla's exclusion, were now stalled. A few parents dropped their eyes, pretending to fuss with a phone or a cappuccino, but their hands trembled, spoons stirred in pointless circles as if they could whisk their embarrassment away. The girls in class weren't laughing anymore either. Instead, some of their eyes slid toward Layla, hesitant, uncertain. They said nothing, but I knew what just happened had shaken what they'd been taught. That difference equals failure. A blonde girl, the one who'd whispered in her friend's ear and burst out laughing, now looked at Layla with something hard to name. Part envy, part awe, part unease. I smiled to myself. Fascinating. Just a few turns and a clean, upright finish, and the balance in this room flipped. No shouting, no debate. Sometimes all it takes is truth standing in the center of the floor for every crooked argument to fall off by itself. The teacher tried to reassemble her poise. She clapped twice, the sound dry and hollow. "All right, thank you, Layla, let's continue." But I heard the wobble in her voice. That thank you lacked its usual authority, like a command bent midair. Everyone in the room heard that gap. I glanced around and caught another parent scratching his neck, eyes on his shoes. He was the one who'd whispered, "Ballet isn't for them." Now he couldn't meet the gaze of a 12-year-old. Ironic. Some truths don't need speeches. They just need to be stared at long enough for someone else to look down. Layla still stood tall, face neither smiling nor frowning. She didn't need to act triumphant. That composure made her look more grown than the adults in the hallway. A few other kids began to copy Layla's movement in silence, as if testing how it might feel. No one said it aloud, but I could see it. An invisible line had just been erased. I drew a breath, filled with a strange feeling. Not a total victory. I know prejudice doesn't evaporate after one solo, but in this moment I could see it cracking, and once a crack shows, it only spreads. A parent beside me whispered to a friend, "The girl actually has talent." The friend nodded, still averting their eyes as if admitting it might betray some old pride. I bit my lip not to laugh. Bitter comedy. Once truth shows up, even compliments have to take the long way round. I looked back at Layla. She quietly stepped to the back line again. No strut, no hunt for approval. That's what makes me proudest. She doesn't need their recognition to know she belongs. Her posture said everything. And in that quiet, I heard my own voice inside. How many times have we been forced to bow our heads? And how many times has a single moment of pride made a whole room drop its eyes instead? I sat still in the lounge, watching through the glass. Layla eased to the back row, shoulders squared, face calm. I heard the room's tight breathing, silence no longer mocking, not yet brave enough to praise. In that hush, I told myself, how many times have we been cut at the door? And how many times has that cut become the opening to rewrite the rules? The question rang, not just for me, but for every black person who stood outside the line, heard cheap laughter, been told they're not the type. How many times have we walked on with fists clenched and heat under our ribs, only to learn that truth always finds its way into the light? I remembered the doors that slammed on me. My first job interview, cheap suit, bright conviction. The interviewer skimmed my resume and smirked. "You sure you're in the right room?" I walked out silent, and years later came back as the partner signing the deal. They thought they'd won. I was the one holding the board. Today, Layla was doing the same thing with a dance. This room thought it was watching a joke. In fact, it had been forced into the audience for a live rewrite. And the author wasn't the teacher or the parents. It was a 12-year-old in scuffed shoes. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and whispered to myself and to my daughter, "Don't fear being shut out, Layla. Every exclusion is just another way in they don't control." A parent near me glanced over, maybe catching the faintest bit of that whisper. He frowned, not understanding. I didn't care. These words didn't need their understanding or consent. They only needed air, enough to echo back at me as a reminder. I looked at Layla again. She inhaled and slipped back into the class's rhythm. No grandstanding, no strain. As if she'd never been excluded, as if that solo hadn't been a trap, but a routine part of practice. That's another kind of pride, not the kind that shouts, just the kind that shows up. I smiled. The irony is rich, eh? They think power lives in saying you don't need to participate. Real power lives in turning don't need into can't do without. Layla just did that without a single rebuttal. I settled back, unexpectedly calm. The anger from earlier remained, but it had changed form into a quiet promise. One day I'll retell this afternoon, not as a memory of humiliation, but as the opening scene of something else. And I wondered, how often does the world think it has the rulebook padlocked? How often do the smallest seams, a dance, a look, a silence, split those rules open? If a child can do it in a ballet studio, maybe the rules outside are waiting to be changed too. The teacher stood there, fists tightening around her packet as if paper could hide her discomfort. The room stayed still. Every eye, every breath leaned toward her, waiting for a new decree. But unlike before, she wasn't the one imposing terms anymore. The silence had put her on the stand. She cleared her throat, dry, too thin to shatter the thick air. Then her voice came, stumbling over the very words she meant to use to hold on to power. "Layla, perhaps you should lead the group next time." The sentence dropped, uncertain, weightless, and broke on contact. The shards skittered across the room for all to see the collapse of a given that had looked like common sense minutes earlier. I tilted my head, taking it in. Here's the sharpest irony. The teacher who smirked and used a mocking invitation to push Layla out of the solo now had to recognize her. What rattled her wasn't just embarrassment, it was fear. Fear that the hallway had seen and heard and would remember the bias she'd just put on display. Layla looked at her, eyes steady. No cheer, no shock, just a small nod, simple but heavy as a gavel tap. "I don't need your praise, but if you're going to speak, let it be plain, the truth won't stay hidden." I saw a few parents glance at each other. One lifted his brows, lips pressed tight to hide confusion. Another bent to retie a shoe, eyes darting, the tell of someone dodging contact with the truth. I smiled. This is life's wicked symmetry. The judge ends up explaining herself. However polished the defense, the crack shows. The teacher went on, voice faint. "Class, get set. Layla, front row." No laughter now, no snide looks. Only young faces, confused, curious, impressed. They didn't grasp it all, but they sensed it. The old order had shifted. Layla walked forward, slow, composed. Each step felt like setting a new brick in this floor. Not just to stand in the front line, but to mark that a once sealed place now has a seam, and that seam won't close. I watched, a strange mix rising, pride and irony. Pride that Layla broke the wall. Irony that the builders were the ones tearing it down. I leaned back, drew a steady breath, and murmured inside. How many times have people stammered to dodge the truth? And how often is that very stammer, the period at the end of the old power sentence? When class ended, I stood up. Layla walked toward me, shoulders still square, face still composed. No more laughter, no more whispers. The room was stone silent, as if it too was fumbling for a way to explain what had just happened. I bent down and took my daughter's small hand. She squeezed back, stronger than you'd expect from a 12-year-old. We headed for the door together. No one stopped us, no one said a word to keep us there. Our two shadows stretched long across the tile, dragging down the glossy hall like a signature scrawled across the silence. Each footfall landed steady, turning into a strange drumbeat in a space that was usually packed with whispering. We didn't need anyone to declare a victory. The silence did it for us. Parents along the wall stared at their phones, heads bowed, but their fingers didn't move. A few girls leaned against the mirror, eyes sneaking toward Layla. No ridicule now, but something else. Curiosity mixed with respect, though they weren't old enough to name the feeling. I smiled, not for them, for my daughter. They thought they owned that room, but in the end, the room betrayed them, refused to be a stage for mockery, and was forced to acknowledge Layla's presence. As we passed the lounge, I saw the teacher leaning on a table, papers trembling in her hand. She avoided my eyes, but she couldn't avoid Layla's shadow sliding by. My daughter's shoulders were calm, her stride straight, leaving a heavy pocket of air behind the teacher. I could see it clearly. Her unease wasn't just losing a moment in class. It was the defeat of a belief she'd thought was untouchable. We kept walking. Our shoes clicked a steady rhythm on the tile, the only soundtrack left in the corridor. Each clack closed a chapter. Quiet, but final. At the main doors, daylight poured in, bright enough to sting. Layla drew a long breath, exhaled, relieved. She didn't speak, but her eyes told me everything. Pride, fatigue, and above all, resolve. I squeezed her hand and whispered, "You did what a lot of grown-ups won't, walked straight through laughter and turned it into silence." Layla smiled softly, eyes shining, and squeezed my hand back. Behind us, the school doors swung shut, but I knew the echo would hang there a long time. They would remember this afternoon, not for perfect combinations, but for the moment a child pushed to the margins, stepped onto the floor, and locked an entire room's jaw. We kept going, our two shadows spilling down the steps like a signature across that room's small history. No pen, no proclamation, yet a contract signed. We don't belong to their contempt, and they never truly owned that room. And I wondered, how many times have we walked out of doors that were never meant for us, only to realize that leaving is the mark that lasts? How often does a room's silence stand as witness to our win? We'd just hit the steps outside when a breeze swept in, carrying off the stale air from the hall. Layla tightened her grip, her eyes still bright, as if the dance's afterglow was still racing through her veins. I wanted to let the moment settle in peace, then hurried footsteps sounded behind us. "Mr. Thompson, please, wait." A parent, impeccable suit, face flushed from the run, hurried out. He was breathing hard, one hand on his chest, the other raised like surrender. I turned. Layla watched him, curious. I waited without hurry. Waited. I didn't know you were a CEO, he stammered. "I'm sorry, we behaved poorly." I tilted my head and let the words hang in the air between us. Clouds drifted slow overhead, as if stretching the pause. Then I laughed, thin, sharp as a blade. "You don't need to know what I do," I said, measured. "You just need to know my daughter taught the whole room a lesson." He opened his mouth to add more, but my eyes stopped him. I wasn't angry, and I didn't raise my voice. That calm made him falter. His lips quivered and closed. He understood. The apology wasn't for us. It was a salve for his own discomfort. Layla stayed quiet, eyes on me. I gave her hand a small squeeze. "You don't need their apology to know you're right. You already proved it." I studied his face, pride wrestling shame. He wanted to save face, but the truth had already been seen by a room full of witnesses. All he had left was a late apology to patch a hole too wide. I sighed softly. The irony stung. They didn't need to know I was a CEO to dismiss my child. But they did need to know I was a CEO to apologize. That flip laid their courtesy bare. It wasn't rooted in fairness, just proximity to power. I set my hand on Layla's shoulder and murmured, "Remember this. It isn't your father's title that made him stop. It was your poise that forced him to look again." She nodded, a small smile telling me she understood. The man bobbed his head, forcing a crooked smile. "She's impressive," he muttered. "We'll remember this." I smiled back, this time not sardonic, but final. "Make sure you do. Because once a black child pushed to the edges can walk to the center, no room belongs exclusively to anyone anymore." He stood there, silent, as if my words had turned into a mirror reflecting his twisted expression. Then he turned and walked back inside. Layla and I moved on. Our shadows stretched in the light, quiet, proud. I didn't need applause or praise. The moment itself was proof. A late apology can't erase bias, but it can expose the truth, that the bias just got rattled at its roots. And I wondered, how many apologies in this world are truly for us, and how many are just to soothe the people giving them? How often does recognition arrive only after they clock your power? And how often is that the clearest evidence that the rules have already flipped? The road ahead lay open, sun breaking into gold patches on the pavement. Layla walked beside me, light step, steady pace, but I could feel the weight of the whole afternoon resting on those small shoulders. Behind us, the door shut in silence. Not the silence of exclusion, but the drop of a curtain on a show they never expected to see. I lifted my head, looked straight ahead. Unspoken lines gathered in my chest, words harder than any rebuttal. I wasn't speaking to Layla or the parents lingering back there. I spoke to the air, to the silence itself. How many times has laughter tried to push us down? And how many times will we turn it into a grandstand? The question hung there, needing no answer. Like a stone dropped on a lake, its circles would travel, touching everyone who'd watched Layla stand tall through their laughter. I knew it would return to them later, at home, over a drink, with the TV on, knocking on the door of memory. Layla looked up at me. She didn't need an explanation. She already knew. In her eyes was a clear acceptance. The laughter won't vanish, but it won't topple her either. One day, that laughter will sit quietly and watch her shine. I thought of the times my life was someone else's entertainment, cut from a team, grilled in a boardroom, told to prove I could lead. They laughed, convinced their laughter proved superiority, and again, I turned that laughter into background music for my ascent. Now Layla had done the same, with a single dance. I smiled, this time not bitter but easy. Funny thing, they think laughter is a weapon. In the end, it's just seating. And we have every right to turn it into our grandstand. Our shadows stretched across the late daylight. It felt less like shadow, more like a message to anyone watching by chance. Some roads aren't paved for us, but each proud step carves a path, marking a trail for those who come after. Layla squeezed my hand, voice small but sure. Daddy, I want to go back next week. I looked at her and nodded. No promise needed. What mattered wasn't whether we returned. It was that she knew the choice was hers. We walked on, the question still hanging in the air like a ribbon not yet tied. It will keep haunting the ones who laughed and keep feeding the ones who kept quiet. And I wondered, next time laughter rings out somewhere, how many will stand upright and turn it into a grandstand? How many times will silence speak louder than any jeer? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.